In 1913, Carl Gustav Jung destroyed his own mind on purpose. He had already broken with Sigmund Freud, the most consequential intellectual break of 20th century psychology. He had renounced the protection of the most powerful name in the field, sacrificed his academic career, and isolated himself from the professional world that had given him identity and authority. But the severance from Freud had done something he had not anticipated. It had opened a door he could not close. Something was rising from beneath him. Not inspiration, not grief. Something older and less willing to be named. He began descending deliberately. In the evenings, after his clinical work ended, he would sit alone and allow images to come. Not as metaphors, not as symbols to be analyzed from a safe professional distance, but as presences, autonomous figures with their own voices, their own wills, their own agendas that ran directly counter to the conscious life he had spent decades constructing. He called what he was doing active imagination. He recorded what he found in handwritten volumes that he kept locked and did not publish in full until nearly 100 years after his death. He called the project the Red Book, and what he discovered inside it was not a theory. It was a map of something that had been moving inside every human being in history, unnamed, ungoverned, and systematically misidentified as the enemy. He had found the shadow. Before any explanation begins, there is a question you may have been living inside without being able to name it. Perhaps it sounds like this. Why do I keep destroying the things I build? Why does the moment something good finally arrives, the relationship, the achievement, the version of myself I fought to become, something in me tilts away from it, undermines it, or watches it collapse as though from a great distance, unable to stop? And beneath that question, a worse one, is this sabotage coming from outside me, from circumstance or other people's failures? Or is it coming from something I cannot locate, something that operates faster than my awareness, something that appears to share my face? These are not character defects. They are not evidence of weakness. They are the signature of an encounter with the most psychologically significant structure in the human interior, a structure the alchemists mapped in their laboratories 4 centuries before Jung named it, and that modern neuroscience has now confirmed operates below the threshold of conscious decision-making. This video will not tell you how to fix it. What it will do is give you the first accurate map of what it actually is, what it is doing inside you, and why every attempt to eliminate it has made the situation worse. The shadow is not your enemy. It is the most important relationship of your life. And right now, it is the one you most completely misunderstand. The first thing to understand about the shadow is what it is not. The popular idea, drawn loosely from Jungian language filtered through a decade of social media psychology, is that the shadow is your dark side. Your violent impulses, your jealousy, your anger, your sexual feelings that polite society has declared illegitimate. According to this version, shadow work means digging up these buried emotions and accepting them. It is framed as a form of self-compassion applied to the parts of yourself you have been taught to suppress. This is not wrong, but it is dangerously incomplete, and the incompleteness is precisely where people get stuck. The distinction that changes everything is this: the shadow is not what is bad in you that you have rejected. The shadow is what is real in you that your identity could not afford to include. That difference is not semantic, it is structural. The shadow does not only contain your rage and your hunger and your capacity for cruelty, it contains your gifts you were told were dangerous, your intelligence that threatened the people who raised you, your sensitivity in a family that ran on emotional numbness, your creativity in a system that rewarded compliance. The shadow is everything that was real enough to exist in you and threatening enough to the people around you that it had to be exiled. not because it was evil, but because its presence was costly. Jung called this the process by which the ego constructs itself. The ego, in Jungian terms, is not the whole self. It is the conscious, socially legible portion of the self, the part that learned to survive by reading the room, and every room has rules. The room of your early family had rules about what was acceptable to feel, to want, to be. Your ego learned those rules the way all young organisms learn survival, by catastrophic feedback. You expressed something real, and the response was withdrawal, punishment, contempt, or abandonment. Even if that abandonment was only temporary, even if it was only emotional. The child's nervous system does not distinguish between types of threat. It records the real thing that caused the dangerous response, and it buries it, not eliminates it. Buries it. The psyche does not have a delete function. It has a basement. This is what the alchemists called the prima materia, the first matter, the raw, chaotic substance that exists before the great work of transformation has begun. The prima materia was always described as vile, worthless, and overlooked. It was found in the most common places. It was the thing that had been discarded. In the alchemical texts, this is never an accident of language. The emerald tablet, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus and cited continuously by alchemical practitioners from Jabir ibn Hayyan in the 8th century through Paracelsus in the 16th, opens with a formulation that has been mistranslated and mystified for centuries. What is above is as what is below. But the operative instruction in the text is not this cosmic correspondence. It is the work itself. The great work begins with what has been thrown away. The philosopher's stone, the final product of the magnum opus, the work of works, is made not from precious metals, but from the substance most people would not bother to pick up off the floor. The alchemists were not describing metallurgy. They were describing psychology. They were describing the shadow. Jung spent 20 years studying alchemical manuscripts, not as historical curiosities, but as the most sophisticated pre-modern map of the individuation process he had ever encountered. Individuation, in his framework, is the lifelong process by which a human being becomes what they actually are, not what they were shaped to be. Not the persona constructed for social consumption, but the total and integrated self that includes every exile, every buried capacity, every aspect of the psyche that the early rooms declared inadmissible. He wrote in Psychology and Alchemy that the alchemists, working in their laboratories with physical substances, were engaged in a process of profound unconscious psychological projection. They were watching their own interior processes reflected in the behavior of matter, and what they described, the stages, the dangers, the transformations, the catastrophic failures, was a map they had not intended to draw. A map of what happens inside a human being when the buried self begins to rise. Neuroscience has now confirmed what this map describes, though in different terms. The limbic system, the brain's primary emotional processing architecture, operates on timescales that precede conscious awareness. The research of neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux and his successors on fear conditioning demonstrates that emotional responses, particularly those shaped in early life, are encoded in neural pathways that fire before the prefrontal cortex, the site of deliberate reasoning, has received the signal. What this means in practice is that the shadow acts before you decide. The sabotage is not a choice. It is a conditioned automatic response, a protection protocol installed in early survival conditions that now fires in circumstances that only superficially resemble the original threat. The relationship that is finally good triggers the exile reflex because goodness was once dangerous. The achievement that finally arrives triggers the disappearance instinct because visibility was once punished. The nervous system does not know the difference between then and now. It knows only the pattern it was taught. This is why insight alone does not solve the problem. You can understand, intellectually, that you are sabotaging something. You can explain the mechanism to a therapist with precision and articulacy, and then go home and do it again. Because the insight exists in the prefrontal cortex, and the behavior is issuing from somewhere far older and far faster. The alchemical tradition understood this. The work was never described as a change in thinking. It was described as a fundamental transformation of substance, not refinement, not education, transmutation, something that changes the nature of the material, not its arrangement. The magnum opus, the great work of the alchemists, was divided into stages. The precise number varied across traditions, but the core structure remained consistent across centuries and cultures, from the Arabic alchemical manuscripts of Baghdad to the Renaissance laboratories of Florence to the Hermetic treatises of Prague. What follows is the map as it actually is, not as it has been simplified. The first stage is nigredo, the blackening. In the laboratory, the alchemist would apply extreme heat to the prima materia, the base substance, and watch it decompose. The substance would blacken, putrefy, and appear to die entirely. In the text, this stage is described with language that should be disturbing: mortificatio, the death of the matter; putrefactio, the rotting. The laboratory instruction was counterintuitive and costly. You had to allow the material to rot. Any intervention to prevent the decomposition would ruin the work. The blackening had to be complete. In the psyche, the nigredo arrives as the moment when the constructed identity can no longer hold. This is not depression in the clinical diagnostic sense, though it may include it. It is more specific than that. It is the collapse of the persona, the mask, the socially negotiated version of the self that has been doing the living. Something in the outer or inner life withdraws its validity. The career that defined you ceases to satisfy, and the satisfaction does not transfer elsewhere. The relationship that organized your sense of self ends or empties of meaning. The belief system that gave coherence to your experience of the world stops answering the questions it used to answer. The structures that made life legible go dark. The specific experience, the one the person in nigredo actually lives, is the loss of narrative continuity. The story you were telling yourself about who you are and where you were going no longer works. And the disturbing part is not the loss of the story, it is that no new story arrives to replace it. There is only the absence. What had organized the interior disappears, and what remains is not grief. Grief, at least, has an object. What remains is a kind of formless pressure, an inarticulable weight, a sense that something essential has gone missing and that the search for it is taking place in a darkened room with no doors. The signs are specific. A deepening inability to perform the identity that used to feel natural, the effortful quality of being yourself, the suspicion that what everyone around you sees is a performance and that behind the performance is nothing recognizable. A withdrawal from the social contracts that used to feel like genuine participation, dreams that return repeatedly to themes of dissolution, flooding, collapse, being lost in buildings with no exits, an irritability or flatness in relationships that previously carried genuine warmth, as though the affective register has been turned down without your permission. The danger at this stage is misidentification. Because the culture has no language for the nigredo as initiation, the person experiencing it routes it through available frameworks: depression, burnout, quarter-life crisis, spiritual emergency. These frameworks are not wrong, but they are incomplete, and their incompleteness produces an incorrect response. If nigredo is depression, the goal is to end it, to restore function, restore mood, restore the capacity to perform the identity that was working before. This is the fundamental error. The nigredo is not a malfunction. It is a necessary decomposition. The persona has to rot. The constructed self has to blacken. Not because suffering is valuable in itself. The alchemical tradition has no interest in suffering for its own sake, but because what is buried underneath the persona cannot be reached while the persona is intact. The prima materia, the exiled real self, the accumulated shadow, it is accessible only in the dark. Any intervention designed to restore the old structure will interrupt the work at its most critical point. Jung named this, using a term from Greek philosophy, enantiodromia, the tendency of any extreme to reverse into its opposite. The psyche that has been organized entirely around light, around social legibility, performance, competence, goodness, will, at sufficient compression, be forced to generate its opposite, not as punishment, as compensation. The unconscious compensates for the imbalances of conscious life. The shadow rises not because something has gone wrong in the person. It rises because something has gone too one-sidedly right for too long. The second stage is albedo, the whitening. After the complete decomposition of the nigredo, something unexpected happens in the alchemical vessel. A white substance begins to appear at the surface of the blackened matter. The alchemists called this the alba, the dawn. In laboratory practice, this was achieved through a process called ablution, washing and purification of the matter that remained after the blackening. But the whitening could only happen after the blackening was complete. The purification requires first that there be nothing left to defend. In the psyche, the albedo is the first emergence of the buried material into consciousness, but not yet as integrated content. It is the beginning of recognition. Things that were completely opaque begin to carry the faint quality of familiarity. Patterns in the self-sabotage that had been invisible now become visible in retrospect, then in real time, then in anticipation. The person in albedo cannot yet stop the patterns from enacting, but they can see them. And the seeing, after the absolute darkness of the nigredo, feels in its early stages like a kind of cold clarity, not warmth, not healing. A luminosity that is still separate from life, still more the quality of a moon than a sun. The alchemists understood this quality precisely. The albedo is the reflection of the light, not the light itself. The danger here is inflation, what Jung called the identification of the ego with the self, the psyche's totalizing center. In the albedo, the person has accessed a quality of witnessing, of self-observation, of clear seeing that was genuinely unavailable before the descent, and this capacity can be mistaken for arrival. The person begins to speak from the clarity as though they now have the map of the whole territory. They begin to identify with the witness, to build a new persona around their capacity for psychological insight. They become the person who has done the inner work in a way that is subtly but unmistakably concerned with being seen doing it. This is the shadow entering through the back door of the work itself. The new persona is still a persona. The albedo is not the destination, it is the washing. The third stage is citrinitas, the yellowing. This stage was largely suppressed or collapsed into the final stage in many Renaissance alchemical texts, which is why it is absent from many modern accounts of the work. This suppression is not an accident of transmission. It reflects something true about the difficulty of this particular passage. It is the stage most likely to be skipped, most likely to be declared complete when it has not yet fully occurred. In the laboratory, citrinitas was associated with solar illumination, the gradual warming of the whitened substance, the appearance of the yellow-gold tone that indicated the matter was approaching its final transformation. But the key feature of the citrinitas was temporal. It could not be accelerated. The yellowing took whatever time it took. There was no alchemical operation that could substitute for duration. In the psyche, the citrinitas is the long middle passage of the work, the period in which the insights of the albedo are being metabolized into character, into actual behavioral change, into a genuinely different relationship with the exiled material. This is the least dramatic stage, and therefore the most often abandoned. The crisis has passed. The initial illumination has occurred. The person has recognized the patterns, has named the shadow material with some accuracy, has had the conversations, done the journaling, sat with the difficulty. And now there is simply the ongoing, undramatic, often boring work of continuing to notice, continuing to choose differently, continuing to resist the pull of the old exile reflex when it fires, as it will continue to fire for a long time after recognition has occurred. The danger is not dramatic. It is the exhaustion of sustained attention. The citrinitas asks for vigilance without the reward of transformation being continuously visible. The work must continue in the absence of evidence that it is working. This is where most people leave, not in crisis, not in rebellion, but in the quiet exhaustion of sustained effort that has no visible completion date. The fourth and final stage is rubedo, the reddening. This is the stage the alchemical tradition considered the most sacred and the most rarely achieved. In the laboratory, the rubedo was the appearance of deep red in the matter, the color the alchemists associated with the completed philosopher's stone, the lapis philosophorum, the substance that had been so thoroughly transformed that it could transform whatever it came into contact with. The Latin name for the alchemical product of the completed work gives the game away. Lapis means stone, not metal, not precious material, not something refined from the base. A stone, something common, something you could find in the road, something that the uninitiated would step over. In the psyche, the rubedo is not the end of the process. This is the crucial misunderstanding that the alchemical tradition warns against repeatedly. The completion of the work does not produce a person who is done. It produces a person who can now consciously participate in the ongoing process. The philosopher's stone is not a static state. It is a capacity, the capacity to hold opposites without resolving them prematurely, to contain the tension between the persona and the shadow without rooting it through projection, sabotage, or collapse. What is actually different in the person who has genuinely passed through the work, even partially, even in one domain of their interior life, is this. The relation to the exiled material has changed from one of unconscious enactment to one of conscious encounter. The shadow is still there, the buried material is still real, still carries charge, still activates in circumstances that touch it. But the activation is no longer invisible. The reflex still fires, but now there is a fraction of a second between the firing and the behavior in which something else is possible. Not control. That is the wrong framework. Conscious relationship. The shadow does not disappear. It becomes a voice in a conversation rather than a ventriloquist with your hands. Jung described the conjunctio, the sacred marriage, the union of opposites, as the alchemical image for this integration. Not the elimination of the shadow by the light, not the defeat of the unconscious by consciousness, but the encounter between them that produces a third thing, something that contains both without being reducible to either. The Sol Niger, the black sun, the alchemical image for the shadow at its most concentrated, its most darkly potent, does not disappear when the rubedo is reached. It is integrated. Its energy, which had been moving through the psyche as undifferentiated destruction, becomes available for actual use. The rage that had been turned against the self becomes the capacity for real limits. The grandiosity that had been leaking out through projection onto idealized others becomes genuine creative authority. The need for disappearance that had been generating self-sabotage becomes the legitimate capacity for solitude and inward attention. This is what the work produces, not a better-behaved ego, a larger self that includes what the ego had exiled. Now it is necessary to say something about the descent that all accounts of this process tend to soften. The nigredo, when it is real, when it is not the performative version adopted by people who have decided to do their shadow work as a form of self-improvement, is one of the most destabilizing experiences available to a human interior. Not difficult, destabilizing. The distinction is important. Difficult suggests effort applied against resistance, and the image this conjures is muscular, directional, heroic. The nigredo is none of these things. What the nigredo actually involves is the removal of the scaffolding, the structures that held the interior together, the goals that organized time, the relationships that provided the evidence of being loved, the work that confirmed the value of existing, the beliefs that answered the questions about meaning before they could fully form. These structures do not break dramatically. They do not break at all in most cases. They become insufficient. They continue to stand functionally in the external world. The career continues, the relationships continue, the routines continue, but the interior has gone silent on them. The meaning has left the form, and the person walking through their own life feels increasingly like a visitor in a story that used to be theirs. The isolation of this experience is not incidental, it is structural. The nigredo cannot be witnessed by others in a way that produces genuine recognition, because the people who have not undergone it do not have language for it, and the people who have undergone it remember it accurately enough to know that no description will help. You cannot be accompanied through the blackening in any conventional sense. Others can be present, they cannot see what you are seeing, and this aloneness, not loneliness, which has a relational quality, but a more fundamental aloneness, the aloneness of being the only person who inhabits your particular interior, is one of the specific experiences the nigredo produces, and that no one who has not been through it will believe is as total as you are reporting it to be. The temptation to return is also more specific than most accounts acknowledge. It is not a temptation to return to happiness. The old state was not happy. If it had been genuinely satisfying, the nigredo would not have arrived. The temptation is to return to legibility, to the version of yourself that other people could read, respond to, mirror back to you. The self in nigredo is not legible, not to others, and not fully to itself. And the loss of legibility is experienced as a loss of reality, not as a metaphor, as a genuine phenomenological uncertainty about whether you exist in a way that has any coherence or continuity. The temptation to return is the temptation to reassert coherence by any available means, to make a decision, any decision, that will restore the sense of being an identifiable person moving through identifiable space towards something that has a name. This is the moment the alchemical tradition calls the most dangerous. Not because the return is evil or cowardly, but because returning here means beginning the entire decomposition process again later, from further behind, with the material now more deeply compressed because it was interrupted before it could fully surface. The vessel must remain sealed. The vas hermeticum, the hermetically sealed container, is the alchemical image for the psyche that agrees to hold the process without releasing pressure. It is the agreement to stay with the disintegration long enough for something new to become visible. What becomes visible, eventually, is not what you expected. The alchemical tradition does not promise that what rises from the blackening will be more beautiful than what went in. It promises that it will be more real. The cauda pavonis, the peacock's tail, the spectacular multicolored display that appeared in the alchemical vessel after the nigredo and before the final stages, was understood as the eruption into consciousness of the full complexity of what had been buried. Not organized, not yet coherent, not yet usable, but real in the way that only things that have survived decomposition can be real. Vivid beyond the range of the constructed persona. Multiple in ways the singular ego cannot accommodate. What eventually emerges, not as a rival, but as a gradual and uneven accumulation, is a self that has a different relation to suffering. Not immunity to it, not the spiritual posture of one who has transcended it. A different relation. The person who has genuinely passed through the nigredo does not suffer less. They suffer more accurately. They can distinguish between the suffering that is the work, the friction of genuine transformation, the discomfort of meeting the exiled self, and the suffering that is produced by the automatic enactment of buried patterns against themselves and others. This distinction, which sounds simple, requires the entire passage to develop. Before the work, all suffering feels equivalent and sourceless. After the passage, suffering has a quality that can be read, the way a cartographer reads terrain. The suffering that comes from the descent into real transformation has a quality of groundedness beneath the difficulty. A sense that the difficulty is happening inside something that holds it. The suffering that comes from the unconscious enactment of the shadow has a different quality. Circular, repetitive, generative of shame, disconnected from meaning, returning always to the same shapes. The person who has moved through the first stages of the work also begins to have a different relation to time. The Chitrinitas teaches patience, but not patience as the passive acceptance of delay. It teaches something closer to what the alchemical tradition called viriditas, the greening, the quiet, invisible vitality of organic growth that has no visible product on any given day, but is continuously producing transformation in the substance. The person begins to understand that they are not behind schedule, that the process has its own temporality, which has never once asked their permission, and that this temporality is not their enemy. This understanding does not eliminate urgency or the desire for things to move faster. It situates those desires correctly as features of the ego, which experiences time horizontally, as a line from past to future. The individuation process does not move on that line. It moves inward and outward simultaneously, spiraling rather than progressing, returning to the same material repeatedly but at increasing depth each time. The philosopher's stone, the lapis philosophorum, the goal of the entire magnum opus, is the psychological state in which this is understood not intellectually but constitutively, not as a concept held by the mind, but as a quality of the self that holds the mind. The stone is not achieved and then possessed. It is a process that becomes, at sufficient depth, indistinguishable from the person. The alchemist said that the stone could transform base metals into gold, and this, in psychological terms, means that the person who has undergone genuine individuation has developed the capacity to meet suffering with transformation rather than with accumulation. Each encounter with difficulty becomes material for the work rather than evidence that the work has failed. And the shadow, which began this entire process, which is the first matter of the magnum opus, which is the substance that has to be recovered from the basement before any real transformation can occur, does not disappear. It becomes, in the Jungian phrase, a consciously held tension. The exiled material returns to the interior as participant rather than saboteur, and the self-sabotage, which was the shadow's method of demanding recognition in the only language available to an unconscious force. Disruption, interference, the termination of everything that looked like the life the exile had not been permitted to live. That language changes. It does not have to speak in destruction anymore. It has been heard. There is a practice that belongs here, not as a shortcut, but as a beginning. Before sleep, take a sheet of paper and write at the top, "What did I react to today that was larger than the situation warranted?" Not what upset you, what over-upset you. The exaggerated response is always a shadow signature. The reaction that arrived with a force disproportionate to the external cause is pointing at something buried, something that shares the shape of the current irritant without being the same as it. Do not attempt to interpret what you find. Write it, sit with it for 60 seconds. Ask, where is the earliest memory of this feeling? Do not chase the answer. Let it surface or not surface. What you are developing in this practice is the capacity to notice the shadow's movement in real time, not to control it, but to begin the relationship with it that the entire work depends on. The relationship is the work. It does not end. It deepens. The sealed vessel that Hermes Trismegistus described in the Emerald Tablet is not a laboratory instrument. It is not even, finally, a metaphor. It is you, the you that agrees to stay with the blackening, to hold the dissolving, to remain inside the process when every survival instinct is recommending exit. The laboratory is not behind the historical walls of some Florentine or Alexandrian tower. It is the interior you have been living in your entire life, burning at its center with a fire you did not light and cannot extinguish. The only question the alchemical tradition has ever asked is whether you will finally, deliberately, attend to what is already occurring there, and whether the attention you bring will be real enough, sustained enough, and honest enough to let the work complete one more turn of its spiral. The gold was never in the metal, it was in the one willing to sit with the black.